Helpful for life.
Beef. It's what's for dinner. Now, if you're from the US, you may recognize that phrase because the beef industry pushed it in a big marketing campaign sometime within the last few decades. Of course, the beef industry is going to want you to eat as much beef as humanly possible because that means they make more money. However, studies have shown that the more beef you eat and the more red meat you eat, it can lead to increased chance of heart disease and cancer, among some other things. So don't eat too much of it, but in moderation, it is fine. As mentioned before, the temperature that the beef is cooked to will affect the chewiness of it, the texture of it, and the appearance of it. However, it also needs to be cooked to a certain level to be safe. As a reminder, please use a thermometer when determining the temperature of your cooked proteins, because that is the only way to do it safely and accurately. Now on your screen, you will see a picture showing the various levels of doneness for beef. In general, the higher temperature that the beef is cooked to, it can increase the toughness of it as well as the dryness. Medium rare is often touted as the sweet spot for steaks, but it actually can vary a lot based on which cut of meat you're using. Whatever you do, however, do not cook your steaks to over 155. That temperature is reserved for ground beef. But Reed, I want to eat my ground beef a little more rare. I like my meat more on the rare side. Well, the reason you can't do that is because when you're working with steaks, they're actually one solid hunk of meat, just like myself. And when they're being cooked, the outside actually raises to a higher temperature than the inside does. And all the germs are on the outside since it's one solid piece of meat. And so all those germs stay on the outside and they get killed. With ground beef, however, all those germs have been mixed inside, so you don't know exactly where they all are. So you gotta cook it to that higher temperature to make sure that they're all killed. But what about beef carpaccio and steak tartare? Those are raw, aren't they? Well, yes, they are raw, and it's never 100% safe to eat raw meat. However, if you stick to only ordering that at the nicer restaurants, then you know that they use the utmost best practices for cleanliness and food handling, and that they are getting food from the best suppliers, so it minimizes that risk as much as possible. Well, that's enough about temperature. What about seasoning? As a rule of thumb, we like to say the more expensive the beef, the less you should have to do to it. So if you got a really cheap piece of beef, then you can season the crap out of it. But if it's a really high quality piece, then let that beefy goodness shine. So what about the different cuts of beef? Well, for steaks, let's say some of the thinner steaks, usually between say 1/4 and 1/2 of an inch. You've got hanger steak, you've got flank steak, just to name a couple of them. These cuts are really good for sandwiches, for salads, for fajitas, and we'll actually have a video later showing you about how we cook these in our beef fajitas. These pieces are great because they cook really quickly, and they're usually less expensive. But you have to be careful to cut those across the grain, otherwise it could end up being too chewy. With a thicker steak, say a ribeye, a sirloin, a T-bone, or a porterhouse, just to name a couple of them, those are usually a lot thicker, say from 1/2 inch, some of them as much as maybe 2, even like 3 inches or something crazy like that. So with these, the beef is usually much higher quality and is very well marbled, and there's fat throughout. So this usually stands by itself in a meal. And depending on your personal preference, some people like to put absolutely no seasoning on it. Some people like to put just salt and pepper, and some people like to put some kind of rub on it. Personally, we like it with just salt and pepper. And then afterwards, as we're eating it, if we want to cut off a piece and maybe dip it in a special spice blend or a nice sauce like a chimichurri or something like that, we'll do it that way. One trick to know when cooking your steaks, though, is that you should pat them dry before you cook them. And the reason you do this is because the moisture on the outside actually takes a lot of energy to boil off. So if you pat it dry, it will do a lot to help it get that nice brown crust that we love to have. That Maillard reaction just makes those flavors so good. Now, steak is actually really good cooked on the grill, as you probably know, but another way that it's really good is cooked on a cast iron skillet that's screaming hot. And when you cook it, what you can do is, as it's near the end, you actually put some butter in and maybe some thyme or some other type of herb, and then you baste that melted butter all on top of that steak, and it just makes it taste so good. And some actually may argue that this type of way tastes better than the grill. It's up to you to decide though. You should try them both and see which one you like better. What about ground beef? Well, ground beef is great for burgers, lasagna, chili, just to name a couple of things. And with ground beef, the most important thing to know is
You need to cook it to at least 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
like we talked about earlier, that's for safety reasons. Now, one tip for when cooking ground beef, cook it on a skillet that's nice and hot and press it flat into one layer on the skillet. That will help aid get that nice browning. And then what you can do is you can flip it and then press it flat again to get that browning. And then lastly, you'll chop it up kind of with your spatula into those small pieces that you're used to seeing. Now, of course, there are other types of cuts. There's ribs, there's roast, there's butts, there's all kinds of stuff. Don't worry too much about getting them all right now. As you cook more, you'll learn more about each of them. But for now, let's get moving.